They tried to shut me out. I became the reason they needed approval. The door that closed. They say every success story begins with a moment of pain, but mine began with silence, the kind of silence that makes you question your own worth, the kind that follows after you realize you've been deliberately erased. And that day, sitting in that glass-walled boardroom, I understood exactly what "they underestimated me" truly meant, not as a phrase, but as a reality I was living in real time, because right in front of me, my own work, my own strategy, my own months of sleepless nights were being presented as someone else's success story, and the worst part was not even the theft, it was how easily everyone accepted it, as if I had never existed, as if I had never contributed, as if I was just another invisible employee in a corporate betrayal story that no one would ever speak about. And when Victor Langford stood there confidently explaining the plan I built from scratch, using my words, my structure, even my exact phrasing, I felt something shift inside me, not anger at first, but disbelief, because I kept waiting for someone, anyone, to say my name, to acknowledge me, to correct the narrative, but no one did, and that was the moment it became clear that this was not a mistake, this was intentional, this was calculated, this was a deliberate move to shut me out, to remove me from the equation so they could take full control. And when I finally spoke, when I calmly tried to remind them that I was the one who developed the strategy, the room didn't react with shock or apology. Instead, they gave me those polite corporate smiles, the kind that hide dismissal behind professionalism, and Victor looked at me with that same controlled expression and said, "Adrian, this level of decision-making is beyond your current role." And just like that, the door was closed in my face without even making a sound, no argument, no confrontation, just quiet exclusion. And in that moment, I realized something powerful, something that would later become the foundation of my rise to power story. They didn't fear me because they didn't see me, and that was their biggest mistake, because people don't protect themselves from what they underestimate. And while they sat there feeling secure in their positions, believing they had successfully pushed me aside, I was already beginning to understand the game at a deeper level, a game where success after rejection is not about fighting for a seat at the table, but about building a table they cannot ignore. And as the meeting continued, I stopped listening, not because I didn't care, but because I had already made a decision, a quiet decision that didn't need announcement. I would not beg for recognition, I would not argue for validation, and I would definitely not stay in a place where my value was deliberately ignored, because this was no longer just a workplace issue, this was a full corporate betrayal story unfolding, and I knew that if I stayed, I would become exactly what they wanted me to be: small, silent, replaceable, and that was not who I was, not anymore. So when the meeting ended and everyone walked out discussing Victor's brilliant strategy, I remained seated for a moment, not in defeat, but in clarity, because something inside me had shifted permanently, and for the first time, I wasn't thinking about proving them wrong, I was thinking about becoming so powerful that their approval would become irrelevant, and eventually, unnecessary. And that thought, that vision, that quiet fire became the beginning of my emotional comeback story. Because what they saw as an ending was actually my starting point, the moment where everything changed direction. And as I stood up and walked out of that room, no one stopped me, no one asked where I was going, no one cared. And that confirmed everything I needed to know. I was already gone in their minds, which meant I was free to rebuild myself without their expectations, without their limits, without their control. And as I stepped outside into the open air, I took a deep breath and made a promise to myself. Promise that would define everything that came next. They shut me out today, but one day, they would need me, not want me, not acknowledge me, but need me, and that difference would change everything, because this was no longer just about survival, this was about transformation, about becoming the kind of person who controls outcomes, who shapes decisions, who turns rejection into dominance. And as I walked away from that building, I wasn't walking away in defeat, I was walking into a new version of myself. One that understood power, one that understood timing, and one that understood that the greatest revenge story is not loud, it is strategic, it is patient, and it is inevitable. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been pushed aside, if you've ever felt invisible in a room where you deserve to shine, then this story is for you, because what happened to me is only the beginning, and what comes next will show you exactly how a denied voice becomes the one that everyone must listen to. So make sure you subscribe, like this story, and stay with me, because this journey from rejection to power is just getting started. The quiet exit. The most dangerous move I made was not speaking back, it was walking away without resistance, because in a world built on noise, silence is often mistaken for weakness, and that was exactly what they believed about me. They thought I had accepted defeat, they thought I had given up, they thought I was just another forgotten name in their corporate betrayal story. But what they failed to understand was that my silence was not surrender, it was strategy, and as I packed my things that day, no one paid attention, no one asked questions, no one cared enough to notice that the same person they underestimated was quietly stepping out of their control, and that moment became the true beginning of my success after rejection, because instead of fighting for a place where I was not valued, I chose to remove myself completely, and that decision gave me something powerful: perspective. The kind of perspective you only gain when you step outside the system that once defined you. And as the days passed, I did not rush into anything, I did not chase opportunities. Instead, I observed, I studied, and I analyzed everything about the environment I had just left. I looked at their structure, their dependencies, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses, because every system, no matter how strong it appears, has a breaking point, and I was determined to find theirs. This was no longer just an emotional comeback story, this was becoming a calculated rise to power story, and I approached it with patience, discipline, and focus. While they continued growing confident in my absence, believing they had removed a problem, I was slowly becoming something they would not be able to ignore. I began building new connections, not the loud kind that attracts attention, but the quiet, strategic kind that creates influence. I aligned myself with people who understood value, people who recognized potential, people who saw beyond titles and positions, and through those connections, I started gaining access to opportunities that were invisible to those still trapped inside the system I left behind, and step by step, I began to rebuild, not just my career, but my identity, because I was no longer the person seeking approval, I was becoming the person who defines it, and that shift changed everything. I invested my time into understanding markets, into studying decision-making patterns, into identifying leverage points that others ignored, and one thing became very clear: the people who once shut me out were not as powerful as they believed, they were simply comfortable, and comfort creates blind spots, and blind spots create opportunities, and I was preparing to take full advantage of that. This was the phase where the story transforms from pain into power, where rejection becomes fuel, and where every moment of doubt is replaced with clarity. And as I continued moving forward, I stopped thinking about proving them wrong, because that mindset keeps you tied to the past. Instead, I focused on building something so strong that their opinion would become irrelevant, something so impactful that they would eventually have no choice but to acknowledge it. And that is the true essence of a powerful revenge story: not reacting emotionally, but acting strategically, not rushing the process, but mastering it. And while they were celebrating short-term success, I was building long-term control, and the difference between those two paths would soon become undeniable, because power is not about being seen, it is about being needed, and I was positioning myself to become exactly that, necessary. And as weeks turned into months, the gap between who I was and who I was becoming grew wider. I became more focused, more disciplined, more aware, and more intentional with every move I made. I learned to move without announcing, to act without seeking validation, and to grow without needing recognition, and that mindset gave me an advantage they could not understand, because they were still operating in a system of visibility, while I was operating in a system of influence, and influence always wins in the long run. And then, the opportunity appeared, not in a dramatic way, not as a big breakthrough, but as something small, something overlooked, something they ignored because it did not seem important. But I saw it differently. I saw its potential. I saw its connection to their structure. I saw how it could become a control point, and in that moment, everything I had been preparing for started to align, because this was not luck, this was the result of patience, of strategy, of understanding the game at a deeper level. And as I stepped into that opportunity, I did so with confidence, not arrogance, not emotion, but quiet certainty, because I knew something they did not. The same person they once pushed aside was no longer playing the same game. I had changed the rules. And as I moved forward, I made one thing clear to myself: I would not rush this process, I would not reveal my position too early. I would continue building, continue growing, continue strengthening my influence until the moment was right, because timing is everything in a rise to power story. And when that moment comes, it must be undeniable, it must be irreversible, it must be complete. And as I looked ahead, I knew that moment was closer than they realized, because while they were still comfortable, still confident, still unaware, I was already becoming the reason their future decisions would depend on approval, my approval. And that is the difference between being underestimated and becoming unstoppable. One is how they see you, the other is who you decide to become, and I had already made my choice. The shift power does not arrive with noise, it arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, and by the time people realize it has shifted, it is already too late to stop it. And that is exactly how my rise to power story began to take shape, not through dramatic moves or public victories, but through small, calculated decisions that slowly changed my position in the game. Because while they were still operating with confidence inside their familiar system, I had stepped outside of it and learned how it truly worked, and that gave me something they did not have, perspective, and with that perspective came clarity, and with clarity came control, and the turning point came disguised as something insignificant, a small deal, the kind of opportunity most people ignore because it does not look impressive at first glance. But I had trained myself to see what others overlook, to understand value where others see nothing. And when I examined that deal closely, I realized it was connected to something much bigger, something directly linked to the same structure that once pushed me aside. And in that moment, I understood that this was not just an opportunity, this was a control point, and control points are where real power begins. So I moved carefully, not rushing, not drawing attention, but positioning myself with precision. I invested my time, my energy, and my focus into building that one opportunity into something stronger, something stable, something influential, and as I did, I continued expanding my network, strengthening my connections, and increasing my reach, because power is never built in isolation, it is built through alignment, through strategy, and through understanding how systems connect, and step by step, I began to create something that could not be ignored, something that was no longer small, something that was becoming essential. And this was where my success after rejection started to become visible. Not to them yet, but to those who were paying attention, those who understood value, those who could see that I was no longer just rebuilding, I was advancing, and the more I grew, the more I noticed something interesting. The same people who once dismissed me were unknowingly moving closer to needing what I was building. Their expansion, their growth, their decisions were slowly aligning with the very space I now controlled, and that realization changed everything. Because it confirmed what I had been working toward from the beginning. I was no longer outside the system, I was becoming part of its foundation, and foundations are not easily replaced, and as this shift continued, I remained silent. I did not announce my progress, I did not seek recognition, because this was not about being seen, this was about becoming necessary, and necessity creates authority, and authority creates control, and control is where the real transformation happens. And while they were still confident, still comfortable, still believing that they had removed me from the equation, I was quietly rewriting that equation entirely. And then came the moment when the connection became unavoidable, when the structure they depended on intersected directly with what I had built, and for the first time, they noticed, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel a shift, enough to question what was happening, enough to sense that something had changed. And that moment is always subtle. It does not come with announcements or headlines, it comes with confusion, with hesitation, with small signs that something is no longer under control, and that is when the balance begins to move. And as I watched this unfold, I did not rush to reveal myself, I did not step forward to claim anything, because timing is everything in a revenge story, and revealing power too early weakens its impact. So I waited, I continued building, continued strengthening my position, continued ensuring that every connection, every decision, every move was aligned with my long-term vision, because this was no longer just about proving them wrong, this was about creating a system where they would eventually have no choice but to come to me, where their decisions would depend on my approval, where their success would require my involvement, and that level of control cannot be forced, it must be built, patiently, strategically, and completely. And as the days passed, I could see the signs becoming clearer. Their confidence was no longer as solid as before, their decisions were no longer as smooth, their system was beginning to feel pressure, and pressure reveals weakness, and weakness creates opportunity, and I was ready for that opportunity, because everything I had done up to this point was leading to one outcome, one moment where the shift would become undeniable, where the roles would reverse completely, where the same people who once saw me as irrelevant would have to acknowledge my position, not out of respect, but out of necessity, and that is the true definition of power, not being recognized, but being required. And as I stood at that point, watching everything align exactly as I had planned, I understood something deeply. They did not lose control because I fought them, they lost control because they underestimated me, and in doing so, they gave me the space to grow, the time to build, and the opportunity to rise without resistance. And now, that rise was no longer hidden. It was no longer quiet. It was becoming real, and very soon, it would become unavoidable, because the shift had already happened. They just had not fully realized it yet, and when they finally do, when they finally understand what has changed, it will not be a question of how to stop me. It will be a realization that they cannot, because I am no longer the person they shut out. I am now the reason they will need approval, and that is how power truly works. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself when it is too late to challenge it. The realization the moment power becomes visible is never loud. It arrives quietly, but it changes everything in an instant, and that was exactly how their realization began, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a simple delay, a pause in their system that they could not immediately explain, because for the first time, something they needed was no longer within their control. And that small disruption marked the turning point in my rise to power story, because what I had been building in silence was now starting to affect them directly, and at first, they treated it like a minor inconvenience, something temporary, something they could fix quickly, because people who operate in comfort always believe they are still in control, even when that control is already slipping away, and I watched as they tried to move forward with their usual confidence, approving deals, making decisions, pushing projects ahead. But something was different now, something was missing, something that used to move smoothly was now facing resistance, and that resistance had a source, and that source was me, even though they did not fully understand it yet. And as the days passed, the pattern became clearer, their progress slowed, their decisions became uncertain, and questions started to rise inside their system, questions about access, about approval, about why things were no longer as easy as before. And that is when the first realization began to form. Not complete, not fully understood, but enough to create discomfort, enough to break their confidence. And in every strong revenge story, there is always a moment where the balance shifts, where the ones who once held power begin to feel its absence. And this was that moment, because while they were searching for answers, I was already holding them, and the truth was simple. They were now operating in a system where I had influence, where my decisions mattered, where my presence could no longer be ignored. And that shift from invisibility to necessity is what defines success after rejection, because it is not about being seen, it is about becoming essential. And as they dug deeper, trying to understand what was happening, they started to uncover connections, small links that pointed towards something unexpected, something they had not considered, and slowly, piece by piece, my name began to surface again, not in the same way as before, not as an employee, not as someone inside their structure, but as someone connected to the very thing they now needed. And that is when the realization became undeniable, because it is one thing to lose control, but it is another to discover that the person you pushed aside is now the one holding it. And I could imagine the moment clearly, the confusion, the disbelief, the hesitation, because this was not part of their plan, this was not how the story was supposed to go. In their version, I was gone, forgotten, irrelevant, but in reality, I had become something else entirely. Something they could not remove, something they could not ignore, and something they could not move forward without. And when that understanding finally settled in, everything changed, their tone, their approach, their confidence, because now they were no longer dealing with someone beneath them, they were dealing with someone they depended on. And dependence changes behavior faster than anything else, because when people need you, they treat you differently, they speak differently, they act differently. And that is exactly what began to happen. Conversations that once excluded me now revolved around me. Decisions that once ignored me now required my input, and access that was once denied to me now became something they had to request. And that reversal is the most powerful moment in any emotional comeback story, because it is not forced, it is earned, it is built through patience, through strategy, through understanding how power truly works. And as I stood in that position, watching everything unfold exactly as I had planned, I did not feel the need to celebrate, I did not feel the need to react emotionally. Because this was never about proving a point, this was about creating a reality where I controlled the outcome, and where they had to operate within the space I defined. And that level of control is not something you achieve overnight, it is something you build step by step, decision by decision, until it becomes undeniable. And now, it was undeniable. And as they prepared to take their next step, to move forward with something they once would have handled easily, they encountered the final confirmation of that shift. a requirement, a condition, a simple but powerful truth. They needed approval, and not just any approval, my approval, and in that moment, the realization was complete, because the same people who once shut me out were now standing at a position where their progress depended on me, and that is the moment where power becomes real, not when you claim it, but when others recognize it, not when you announce it, but when they feel it. And as that moment settled in, I understood something clearly. This was no longer just a story about rejection. This was now a story about control, about transformation, about becoming the one who defines the outcome. And the journey was not over yet, but the balance had already shifted. And from this point forward, nothing would ever be the same again, because they had finally realized what they had created. They did not remove me, they made me stronger. They did not silence me, they made me strategic. And now, they did not just see me, they needed me. And that is a position that cannot be undone. The final position: power is not loud when it is real, it is calm, controlled, and undeniable. And by the time everything reached its peak, I was no longer chasing anything. I was simply standing in a position I had built with patience, strategy, and focus. And that is how my rise to power story reached its final stage, not with chaos, not with revenge in anger, but with complete control. Because the same people who once ignored me were now moving carefully around me, measuring their words, adjusting their actions, and waiting for my response. And that shift did not happen overnight. It was the result of every decision I made after they underestimated me, every moment I chose silence over reaction, every time I focused on growth instead of validation. And now, everything had come full circle, because their system, the same system that once pushed me aside, was now structured in a way that required my involvement to function properly. And that is the highest level of success after rejection, when you are no longer trying to enter the room, but the room cannot operate without you. And I remember the moment clearly, the meeting that confirmed everything, the same kind of boardroom, the same kind of setting, but a completely different reality, because this time, I was not sitting quietly in the corner, I was at the center of the decision. And when Victor Langford walked in, he was no longer the confident man presenting stolen ideas. He was cautious, aware, and uncertain. Because he understood something that could not be ignored. He needed my approval, and that single truth changed the entire dynamic of the room. Because power does not need to be announced when it is already recognized. And as the discussion began, I listened carefully, not because I needed to learn anything new, but because I wanted to observe how far things had changed. And it was clear in every word, every pause, every glance in my direction. They were no longer in control. And when the moment came for the final decision, the room fell silent, not the same dismissive silence I experienced before, but a different kind, respectful, cautious silence. The kind that waits, the kind that understands that the outcome depends on one person, and that person was me. And in that moment, I felt no anger, no need for revenge, no desire to embarrass anyone, because this was never about emotions, this was about transformation. This was about becoming the kind of person who defines outcomes. And I spoke clearly, calmly, and directly, not to prove a point, but to set the direction, because that is what real power looks like. It is not loud, it is precise. And as I gave my decision, I could see it on their faces, the realization, the acceptance, the understanding that the balance had shifted completely, and that there was no going back. And that is what makes a true emotional comeback story powerful. Not the moment of rejection, but the moment of control, when everything changes without force, without noise, without conflict, just through presence and position. And as the meeting ended, something else became clear. They were no longer trying to push me out, they were trying to stay close. Trying to rebuild connections, trying to adjust to a reality where I was now essential. But power does not come with obligation, and respect cannot be forced after it was once denied. And that is the lesson they had to learn, because this was not about giving them what they wanted. This was about maintaining what I had built, protecting my position, and continuing to operate on my own terms. And as I stepped out of that room, I realized something important. The journey that started as a corporate betrayal story had become something greater. It had become a story of growth, of discipline, of understanding how to turn rejection into strength, and how to transform silence into influence. And that transformation is what separates those who stay stuck from those who rise, because being underestimated is not a weakness, it is an opportunity to grow without pressure, to build without interference, and to rise without being noticed until it is too late to be stopped. And now, standing at this point, I knew that this was not the end. It was simply a new beginning, a new level, a new standard, because once you understand power, once you experience control, once you become the one people depend on, you can never go back to being invisible again. And that is the true meaning of this story, not revenge, not validation, but transformation. And if you have ever been ignored, if you have ever been pushed aside, if you have ever been made to feel like you do not matter, then remember this: your moment has not passed, it is being prepared, and when it comes, it will not need noise, it will not need approval, it will only need your readiness. So stay focused, stay patient, and keep building, because your rise to power story is already in motion. And if this story inspired you, if it made you see your situation differently, then make sure you subscribe, like this story, and stay connected, because this is more than just a story. It is a reminder that being underestimated is often the first step to becoming unstoppable.